Okay, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the research essay, your last essay for the course. I had some students email me asking for a little bit more clarification and to basically give you a little bit more information about what's expected. It is a research essay, which just means that I expect you to use primary sources, that is the course text, the novels. So you have to have a primary text as your main focal point, which in this case is either going to be Spiegelman's Mouse or Jan Martel's Life of Pi, or some combination of either of those. And then you're also, for the research part, you're going to use secondary sources. So a secondary research source can be anything from a library book to a journal article to a website, but it has to be something that you find that is other than the book that we're reading in the course. So, for example, I usually, if I'm writing a research paper for an English class, I want to read what other critics have written about that book or that story. So I'm going to go into Google Scholar, I'm going to look at the library and search what materials they have about that author or about that subject matter. And I'm going to sort of scan through, try to find some information that maybe can help me talk about this book from a very sort of informed perspective. So 3 to 5 secondary sources is what I'm asking for. Peer-reviewed journals are obviously the best, or books. That just means they've been fact-checked and peer-reviewed, meaning it's not just a Wikipedia article or something that hasn't been vetted by, a publisher. Because people can just publish whatever they want on the internet, and it can be sometimes, you know, not quality writing or not reputable sources. It could be just a blog post. So that could be a secondary source technically, but it's just not one that maybe you want to use for a high-level academic paper. For this one, like if you wanted to use Wikipedia, you could, but I wouldn't really count that as a prime, like one of your 3 to 5 secondary sources. It would be on top of that. But that's always, you can always start there and then look in the bibliography, see what else has been written about that book, or that story, or that author, or even that subject matter, and find your research that way. And of course, you know, your main focus is going to be on the actual course text. So I don't want you to make your thesis statement too broad for the research essay. I still want you to focus on the literature of the course. So for example, I don't want you to just talk about animals in general and then just bring in 1 or 2 examples from mouse. I want you to actually structure your paper around mouse and then bring in other research sources to back up your thesis. So that's my basic overview of how I would go about researching the paper. But like I said, Google Scholar, good place to start. You could do a general Google search, and it will bring you to probably just websites, that kind of thing. But if for the more reputable sources, I would use a database like Google Scholar, or use the Regina library database. And a lot of that stuff is all online, so you can find journals and find out what other people have written about Art Spiegelman's Mouse or Jan Martel's Life of Pi. So there's a lot of essays written about those 2 books, and you can find what other people have written about them, and then quote them, right? So you're saying in so and so's article, he argues that, um, you know, and then go on to explain what other people have written about that book. So you want to make sure you're doing that in your research paper. And it's always good to name your sources. So tell me where you found that, or who wrote that, or where you're getting your information from. Don't just sort of drop other people's ideas into your paper. Make sure you're setting up where you've gotten that information, where it's coming from, who said it, are you paraphrasing, are you quoting, all that kind of information should be sort of clear in your writing. Okay, so let's go through a little bit of these essay prompts just to further explain expectations or ideas that might spark your interest. So the first one, explain the animal allegory in Spiegelman's Mouse or Jan Martel's Life of Pi. How does each author use animals to represent larger truths about humanity or human nature? Okay, so we've been talking about animal allegories throughout the course, where animals are used as a representation of humans, human society, human behavior, human nature. So in the case of Mouse, Art Spiegelman's Mouse, he's using animals to represent ethnic groups during World War II, the conflict of World War II. So the ethnic conflict primarily between Germans and their victimization of Jewish people. And he's using the animal allegory of cats and mice. So the question here is asking, just basically explain that allegory, but also why and how does that author's use of animals represent larger ideas about humanity? And I think Spiegelman's really bringing to light some of the truly cruel extremes that humans have inflicted on each other throughout history and continue to inflict on each other in terms of oppression, persecution, genocide. So he's really shedding light on some horrible aspects of human society and maybe even human nature in our ability to cruelly persecute others based solely on somewhat superficial divisions. Okay, so that one you could definitely talk about, what is Art Spiegelman's purpose in using animals. In Jan Martel's Life of Pi, the animal allegory relates more to Pi's first and second stories, I guess we'll say, and how he if you interpret it that way, if uses animals as a sort of coping mechanism to deal with the trauma of surviving on a life raft with, in his second story, human survivors who are cruel and again resort to very animalistic behaviors in order to survive and sort of almost become animalistic in that survival scenario, resorting to cannibalism, murder, and extremes, violence, that type of thing. So he's again highlighting something maybe in about human nature when he's using animals in to stand in for humans in that second story. So you could talk about that and how animals are somehow reveal something about the extremes of survival, or what the survival instinct of humans, or the animalistic nature of humanity, something like that could be a thesis. Second question, discuss the external and internal conflicts in any one of the characters in either Mouse or Life of Pi. What are the physical obstacles that have to be overcome? What are the inner conflicts or obstacles that the character is struggling with? So external conflicts, those are things that happen outside of the person. It could be anything from warfare, imprisonment, the struggle against nature, life and death struggles against another person or against an animal, anything that sort of is is physically threatening to that person, whether that's nature or a larger than life natural force, physical hand-to-hand combat, anything like that would be an external conflict. And then the internal conflict is a little bit more, it's like the psychological conflict that happens on the inside of a character that maybe they are struggling with. So it could be like a crisis of faith, which maybe Pi goes through, for example. It could be a crisis of overcoming depression or loss, of feeling hopeless, powerless. But it's something like that that happens on the inside of a person that they have to kind of overcome by being, by having hope or having an inner strength, or by not giving up, endurance, all those kind of, determination, all these things that kind of help someone overcome feelings inside that they might have, that those doubts or fears that are inside them that they have to struggle with. So in Mouse, you could talk about, external conflicts obviously are the persecution and imprisonment inflicted on Vladik and Anya. The conditions in the prison are very inhumane, and they're obviously under a lot of danger and stress, and the threat of violence is always there, and the threat of death looming over them. So there's external conflict at that time. But internal conflicts, we also see a character like Anya struggling within herself, wanting to give up, not wanting to carry on. We have Vladik having a kind of inner strength to overcome. He never really gives up hope. He believes in love. He always, he never doubts his ability to overcome and to survive. And he's always, he just doesn't give up, right? He's willing to fight for his life. And inner conflicts and outer conflicts, or external conflicts for Pi, you could talk about obviously his struggles against nature, the natural environment, the ocean, the animals in the ocean, sharks, the animals aboard the life raft, and just, things like weather, heat, thirst, hunger, all these things could be external pressures based on the environment. Internal struggles are more like things like his crisis of faith, or, losing hope, dealing with depression and loss. All those kinds of things would be going on inside of him, and also kind of an ethical conflict with his character. He does kind of transform from being very innocent and he goes from being vegetarian and very sort of meek to being, having to fight for his life and summon that, inner strength that's kind of symbolized by Richard Parker, the tiger, right? So that kind of becomes his inner strength. Okay, and then number 3, discuss the theme of survival in either Mouse or Life of Pi. What makes someone a survivor? What are the survival strategies used by each character? So this would be one you could definitely do a sort of compare and contrast if you wanted, or focus on just one of the books. but you could talk about, the, what was it that allowed Vladek to survive? What was it that allowed Pi to survive? Was it their, quick thinking? Was it their faith in a higher power? Was it their sense their willingness to use what was around them, their resourcefulness, all these things you could sort of, or was it just, based on luck? So all of these things kind of maybe could be discussed in relation to either one or the other or both of those texts. And, sometimes survival means, you're physically surviving the scenario, but maybe psychologically you don't necessarily survive without scars or wounds in terms of psychological memories or traumas that also can occur for a character or for a person. Number 4, why did each author select the specific type of animals they did in each book? Whether it was the orangutan in Life of Pi or the cats and mouse, each animal type seems to symbolize some important idea for the author. Discuss the meaning of animals in your essay. So this one's kind of similar to number 1 in terms of animal allegory, but it's allowing you to sort of focus specifically on animal characters and what they might represent. So in my lectures on mouse, I did discuss, sort of some of the thoughts on why Art Spiegelman chose the animals that he did. We talked a little bit about borrowing from propaganda that dehumanized Jewish people and represented them as animals. So he's sort of borrowing from that, but reimagining it from a position of exposing the cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazis in their project to dehumanize and essentially murder a group of people. So yeah, he's using cats, like we said, as a kind of representation of the predatory mindset, and mice as a way of representing the sort of powerlessness and the dehumanization of Jewish people at that time in history. For Life of Pi, it's not as straightforward, I guess. You can kind of allow your mind to sort of play with some of the interpretations of why he picked which animals that he did. But there are certain specific animals chosen. There's the orangutan, that is kind of a representation of Pi's mother, or corresponds with the kind of maternal, very human-like side of humanity, or humane side, or nurturing side. It is, the orangutan is described as a mother of 2 sons and as the most human of all the animals aboard the life raft, and it seems to represent a kind of kinder, gentler, maybe form of person. And then the tiger, we know, represents something powerful, deadly, dangerous, but also kind of awe-inspiring. It makes me think, we talked about Blake's poem, The Tiger, and all those things that maybe are represented in that image as well. Could be a representation of even the dark side of humanity, which Pi seems to have to tap into. And then the hyena, of course, represents just this, very brutal, cruel, repulsive side of human nature that resorts to just ruthless, cannibalistic, behavior when put under an extreme situation. So, yeah, you could definitely play with those ideas and just talk about animal symbolism or choices made by the author and what you think those could symbolize. Number 5, how does each novel represent the blurred line between humans and animals? In what ways are humans and animals the same? In what ways are they different? In what situations do humans become animalistic? In what situations do we humanize animals? So this one is pretty packed in there, but you could pick one or more of those kind of questions to sort of build your own thesis. Um, but again, I want you to focus on the novels, one or more of them, in your thesis. So you could talk about, where that line is blurred between humans and animals as it is portrayed in Life of Pi. And say, you could say, like, in a survival scenario, the line between humans and animals is blurred because humans, uh, will do anything in order to survive, even uh, become murderous, cannibalistic, um, selfish, whatever you want to call it. So when we say the word animalistic, what do we mean? It means sort of driven by our instincts. It means um, survivalist, based off of life and death, that kind of thing. We also could talk about, if you wanted to just narrow it down to why we humanize animals, you could talk about anthropomorphizing animals, why we do that, why authors might do that, and then use examples from Mouse, say, to um, discuss why that author might maybe use an anthropomorphized animal to represent that historical event. And then the last one, discuss the ethical dilemmas faced by one or more characters in Mouse or Life of Pi. What is considered right or wrong, good or evil, in relation to how we treat others, both human and animal others? So yeah, you could talk about some of the ethical dilemmas faced by one or more characters. So in Mouse, you could talk about questions of betrayal in Mouse and how there are certain ethical dilemmas faced by individuals, and they often choose the most self-serving option. In some cases, if it's between you and me, I'm going to save myself and turn you into the police or whatever. So it becomes a kind of ethical dilemma about what is right or wrong. You could talk about the ethical dilemma of having to, when they lost Rishu, and Tasha had to choose between, poisoning herself and the children or allowing them to face that reality of being taken away to a concentration camp. So this question of right and wrong, good or evil, could be applied there. To Life of Pi, it seems to be an easier application. The ethical questions that Pi faces in his survival scenario are pretty much related to his vegetarianism, to take a life, to his cannibalism, to his conflict with the hyena slash the French cook, and what happens between those two characters. So there is this question as well that is brought up by these two books that deal with survival and what it is that we do when faced with a life or death situation. Okay, so I think that's all. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm going to be posting a little overview of the final exam, so keep your eyes open for that as well.